Welcome to another instalment of our Videocast series, where we talk to change-making champions about their work and ambitions for achieving greater equality. My name is Priya Sani Nicholas, and I'm one of the co-executive directors of the Equality Trust. We're the only charity in the UK dedicated to campaigning for people to have a good life, and we do that by reducing inequalities of income, wealth, and power. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Vanessa Boon. Vanessa is known as a joyful disruptor and also for her inspiring training sessions that empower policymakers and community stakeholders at both national and local levels to become change makers. Her approach fosters co-production and collective action for social change. Recently, Vanessa, you just joined the staff team of the Equality Trust, bringing with you your years of experience and expertise as a specialist in equity and social justice. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.
So we're here today to primarily talk about the socio-economic duty. But before we get into that, I just wondered if we could start by inviting us both to kind of pause and give a bit of attention to this vision of the Equality Trust, which is so simple but yet so elusive. And that is for everyone to have a good life, not just already affluent, not just people like you and me, but literally everyone. And then it also raises the question, what is a good life? So if I may, I'd like to start there. What does a good life mean to you, Vanessa?
There's so much on my wish list. I think, what the good life that I'd want everybody to be able to have. And like you say, it's beyond just getting by, which is what so many people, struggle through. So I think the word freedom really comes to mind. So, freedom from that constant worry about how you're going to make the rent this month, how you're going to put food on the table, freedom from oppression, harassment, fear, and freedom to enjoy green spaces, blue spaces, arts, culture, heritage, these things that should be for everyone. And like so many movements have gone before have said, bread and roses. We don't just want the basics. I want universal, wonderful life, not universal basic living.
Yeah, I love that. I'm reminded of that bread and roses. It's it really, encapsulates exactly what we're all kind of working for. Definitely. Thank you for that. So Vanessa, can you explain your view of the SED, why it's so important and what kind of potential impact it might have in addressing some of those things?
Yeah, I'm really excited actually about this socio-economic duty, and not least because I've been waiting 15 years to get it done. Because for anyone who's not familiar, socio-economic duty, or the SED, is Section 1 of the Equality Act. It was passed through Parliament back in 2010, and in a nutshell, it means that policy setting at both national government and local council levels must consider how they can do those things in a way that reduces inequalities of outcome associated with socioeconomic disadvantage. And this is the closest our law in this country has ever got to addressing issues of class, socioeconomic inequalities, the rich-poor gap, unequal access to resources. So we've had so many child poverty reports saying the same things. We know the problem. What we need is something to disrupt it. So what I like about this duty is that it's proactive. At the very first point of designing policy and setting strategy and budgets, it's asking you to proactively consider how can you make a positive impact as a policy maker. And it's pretty historic. Like I said, it's the first law of its kind. I think this is a once in a generation moment. And I know when I was talking to my dad about this, he talked about remembering the first Equal Pay Act in 1970 and how that was a huge moment. And likewise for sex and race discrimination acts that came in the 70s, the Disability Rights Campaign has won the Disability Discrimination Act in the 90s. And I think all of these moments, although no law is a magic wand to fix everything on its own, law is historic and disruptive, and it changes the conversation as well as changing policy. So yeah, I'm excited about its potential to tackle the multiple crises we're facing.
So I wonder if you can share with us some of your kind of top learnings.
One thing that we looked at was the meaning of non-commencement since 2010, but then also the potential of the duty once activated. So I concluded, based on all those different sources, that the meaning of its non-commencement is really, it's a serious injustice that we've been denied this protective duty, particularly at a time when we've seen austerity policies pursued that have had such a drastic, and harsh consequences, spanning rising child poverty and destitution even. We're known as Food Bank Britain globally. The United Nations has criticised the UK government for failing to fully commence a law that was democratically passed through our system in 2010. Many charities have challenged this as well. So the meaning of its non-commencement is a real injustice, and would be scandalous, I think, if just more people knew about it. I think there would perhaps be public outrage, so I'm keen to make more people aware of what's happened. But in terms of its potential, what's really exciting is how it could make a difference.
Sorry,
You want to pause?
I did just want to ask a question about the meaning of its non-commencement, if I may. So have I heard this correctly? Does it mean that if it had been commenced back in 2010, that maybe austerity might not have been able to take place? It might have been unlawful, kind of thing.
I think it's hard to say that it could definitely have stopped everything, but for sure, I think it's fair to argue that it would have been a really useful challenge to it. It could have paused the design of those policies, provided time to challenge the government and hold them accountable, to provide evidence of, how is this going to impact different communities, particularly the most disadvantaged. We also would have had the watchdog powers of enforcement through the Equality and Human Rights Commission to keep things in check if they weren't doing it, and a lot of austerity policies. Legal scholars have argued that things like the two-child cap, limit on benefits, some of the things like universal credit sanctions, and other policies that have had such harsh impact, like the cuts to disabled people's benefits, like PIP, that have had drastic consequences. One study by Walsh at Glasgow University found that just between 2012 and 2019, that there were around 350,000 austerity-related excess deaths.
Yeah.
And I think
is that UK wide or just Glasgow?
That's UK wide, and that's an estimate could be higher, but that was just during 2012 to 2019, so not even the whole period that we've had.
And not even COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they accounted for all those sort of other factors. Austerity being, directly responsible for worsened poverty, hardship, and causing death really highlights the seriousness of the non-commencement of the duty. I think it could have really challenged and given us a bit of a check and balance on power.
Yeah, thank you. And so going forward, sorry, I interrupted you, and you were just about to kind of tell us a bit more about the benefits or the potential benefits.
Yeah, so the potential, I think, is that pause for thought. And some of the litigators that I spoke to said how that can be so useful. Learning from the application of the public sector equality duty, which is a wider duty. People may be familiar on the other protected characteristics such as race, disability, and so on. And that prompts public policy makers to think about how the way they design a service or a policy or the way they allocate resources is going to impact people on the basis of race, disability, and so on. So adding a socio-economic dimension to that is going to be really powerful because those often intersect and overlap as well. So that pause for thought is what litigators say can be really helpful. And sometimes you don't even have to bring a legal challenge to court, but just often a letter to remind a public body that, I see you're proposing to cut all our youth clubs or a disability service or whatever it is. Have you considered the impact? What is your analysis and how is that really informed? And have you heard from the voices of the people who will be most affected, so the voices of lived experience? And I think that's where the really powerful potential is in this, to push towards more public participation, more people power and voice in setting policies, to make sure the people who actually know what it's like are in the room.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a vital, piece of the jigsaw that seems to be missing. And I think we had it at one point in our, not too distant future, but it's slowly been eroded. And it's a key thing that lots of people are saying could really help push back against the rise of the far right. This at the moment, the only elements of democratic participation that most people have is voting once every kind of 4 to 5 years. And actually, how much change are we voting for? What difference does our vote actually make? So I think it's been called the Medici curse, whereas the rich and powerful get more rich and more powerful and buy their influence into the political process, and designing policies that suit their neoliberal kind of desires. People on the other end of the spectrum are losing faith and withdrawing and disengaging with the democratic process as opposed to the political process. So anything that we can do that supports, more engagement, more participation, people feeling more power and influence in their own lives. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we know throughout history that in times of scarcity, it's so much easier to stoke that, divide and rule trick,
Yeah.
upon people, sadly. And people can even vote against their own interests, and we're not great at political education in this country and consciousness raising. We have a long journey to go on, I think, there. So, yeah, those populist and far right narratives we're seeing sadly take hold. And I think what I'm really interested about the potential of the socio-economic duty to help with that in terms of actually unifying people, anyone who's not an Uber millionaire, billionaire even, is at a socio-economic disadvantage. Of course, some people are at the worst end of that scale. But there's also the squeezed middle who are really feeling the impact over the last decade and a half as well. And I think the socio-economic duty places the responsibility for that issue purely, on policymakers and those structural policy design issues, which is quite a shift from what we've seen before of narratives of blaming individuals for their hardship, or even worse, pointing fingers at scapegoats, like people arriving across the channel, which is not the source of people's woes because of austerity cuts that have been decided by people in Westminster.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope this will have some unifying impact to counter those divisive narratives.
And I just wanted to pick up on something, you mentioned there about scarcity. And actually, we are a really rich country, but we're fed this narrative that we have limited resources, limited capacity. Well, maybe it's part of the reason we've got limited resources and limited capacity is because the same people are just taking those resources and the finances out of the system and hoarding them. If you've already got billions and you have another couple of million, you don't need it, you're not spending it, it's not going back into the economy, it's just being hoarded or being used to buy up even more of the nation's assets. So there it's very real to feel the scarcity, but actually if you do the maths and look at the thing, that there doesn't need to be a scarcity, I suppose, is what I'm trying to kind of hone in on here. But yeah.
Yeah, it's deliberately created, and it's false. It doesn't exist naturally. Have an abundant planet, if only we don't exploit it, and some people just hog it all and don't learn to share. And so I hope this discourse is shifted by thinking through this socio-economic duty lens of re-examining the injustices and actually, going back to your first question, actually everybody could have a good life if we just shared.
Yeah, absolutely love it, Vanessa. So why is the socio-economic duty important now? What's its journey?
Gosh, I mean, it's been sitting there dormant on the statute book since 2010, and I love legal scholar Sandy Fredman from Oxford University described this in a way that I thought was delicious. He said it's constitutionally dubious. Is that great? I would have said well dodgy, but she put it much more eloquently than me. So the idea that a law is passed and then just ignored and abandoned, it raises real questions for democracy. But I think after, over a decade and a half of austerity cuts, rising child poverty, deaths, hardships, and the current topical issues of, the green paper on even more cuts, being proposed, and particularly impacting disabled people, widening inequalities, enough is enough. We are facing so many crises in this country that are avoidable and unnecessary suffering, and shouldn't be. The struggles of the economy shouldn't be kind of placed as a burden upon those of the least. As you say, there are people with an abundance of resources, people who are avoiding tax, there's people who are not contributing to society, and hogging wealth. So there's a real opportunity to think, what could taxation policy look like? What could housing and education policy look like? So many questions about policies that could be different if we were inspired by designing them in a way that reduces inequalities of outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the socio-economic duty, it was Section 1 of the Equality Act when it was written in 2010. Like you say, it's sat uncommenced when the rest of the Equality Act was commenced when the coalition Conservative and Lib Dem government came in. So is it looking like the socio-economic duty is going to be commenced now with this new Labour government?
Yeah, so obviously it was originally brought in under a Labour government back in 2010, but in that same year, very shortly after, a general election brought in the coalition government led by the Conservatives, who announced quickly that they were scrapping the socio-economic duty, and they said they were going to offer social mobility and levelling up instead. I think we all know how that panned out. So yes, those broken promises leave us really desperate for it. So in the last general election, Labour was in their manifesto pledge to resurrect this duty, and now in government, they have now opened a consultation and are working on how to implement it. So from April to June 2025, the consultation or call for evidence is open for people, researchers, academics, social change agents can contribute and input to that process and call for effective implementation. There's a good opportunity to look at how we can improve and strengthen how that duty is then applied across Great Britain. And importantly, of course, Scotland and Wales did activate the duty back in 2018 and 2021, respectively, and have got some evidence of how it's already working well there. But England has been left behind, so it feels really urgent to get that consistency across the whole of Great Britain.
Thanks. And you mentioned meaningful commencement. Do you have kind of recommendations or thoughts or ideas about what would make or help the commencement to be meaningful?
Yeah, certainly from my research, I made a number of policy recommendations about how we can enhance it. And although part of me would love to take a red pen and, really edit the wording, I see kind of this as a starting point rather than a magic wand, a stepping stone to a stronger law over time. But this has got real potential. But one of the ways that we can strengthen it and input our voice on this to the call for evidence is to ask for kind of meaningful statutory guidance that is really going to make things clear, so there's not confusion among policymakers out there who need to implement this, including at local authority level. How to do this well, and one of the things we're particularly keen on is co-production. So, policymakers don't have all the kinds of knowledge, but those of lived experience can bring their knowledge on what could be done differently, both nationally and at the local level, to make things better and reduce hardship, and policies that sometimes make things worse unnecessarily just because no one's realised that the human impact of that policy is having. So co-production is a really important ingredient. I'm also keen to expand the list of public authorities covered. So currently it's national government, local councils and police and crime commissioners. The NHS was originally in the wording back in 2010. That has been snuck out since. I'm keen to get that back on the list. And I'd really like to see it mirror the public sector equality duty, because that's actually applied to a much, much wider range of public bodies, including fire and police services, all kinds of councils like parish councils, which are not currently in the said list, and all sorts of regulatory bodies like Ofcom, Ofsted, and organisations like the BBC. And there we could really maximise the impact of that wider application. And there's also an exclusion of people on the basis of any socioeconomic disadvantage arising as a result of being subject to immigration control. And this is clearly an injustice, and legal scholars have suggested it breaches our international human rights obligations. So we always want to challenge that two-tier legislation and seek universal coverage.
So recommendations are to ensure that participation is a central ingredient of how policy is designed, is to increase the number, or maybe mirror the number of public bodies that it applies to, and to scrap the no recourse to public funds situation, which means that the duty doesn't apply if you've got no recourse to public funds for people with, under immigration control.
That's right. Yeah. And, it needs some resources putting in to make sure that we've got an effective watchdog that's well resourced with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to roll out guidance and training to help policymakers, but also the charitable and community sector to be, informed, empowered, critical friends, and to hold national and local authorities to account. And that's often what's worked well with other laws that we've seen over the years.
Okay, cool. Because I think, I've been to one of your trainings, Vanessa, and I just love the way that you challenge everybody to remember why they wanted to work in public service. Actually, everybody, so many people go into those positions because they want to do good, they want to help people, and it really feels like, getting back in touch with your kind of inner superhero and having some legislation and tools to support you to achieve those dreams that you set out to do. You know, here's some guidance, here's a framework, here's how it should be done, here's some good practice. You know, it really feels like we're pushing ourselves back into the right direction, because another great thing always makes me think about the wording of the SED, which, as you said, you'd like to take a red pen to elements of it. But, the crux of it really reminds us that inequalities of outcome, not just inequalities of opportunity, but inequalities of outcome, do manifest just from, existing within a socio-economic deprivation. So that's kind of, I think, two really important things there. But finally, that actually we can do something about it. There is a recognition that public bodies can design policy to reduce those inequalities of outcome. And surely, that's what we really need to be doing. Nobody should be working in full-time employment and still living in poverty. Nobody should have, such barred access to resource that they can't live a good life. I mean, that's
Yeah, and that definitely reflects what I see when I've worked both within and supporting those in the public sector. And like you say, often people join because they have that fire in their belly to make a difference as a teacher, a social worker, a nurse, etc., working for their local authorities because they care about their local communities and they want to make things better in the neighbourhood they grew up in and to have better chances than they had that they want to pass to the next generation, right? We always want to pass on the world better for the kids and generations to come. But sometimes that motivation can be worn down, and I really want to relight that fire in people's bellies, that passion of the public sector, because the system can weigh you down and bureaucracy can be exhausting, but this duty is a real enabler, to say actually this is going to back people who are making arguments to their organizations with internally, as I like to call them, as the internal change makers, who are saying I want to do something to make a difference, I've got an idea, and this could give them some backing, I think, to do that. And I'm thinking of a friend and fellow activist I know who's a teacher, and she was saying that one of her colleagues at lunchtime at school saw a child miming eating their lunch from an empty lunchbox. And I think, when we get across, for all the arguments over the wording or the timing of this duty, that for me is getting to the real human issue of what this is about. We can design that out through good policy making, through the way we use budgets and resources. And that's, I think, exciting potential. We can be backing teachers like that who want to make a difference to issues like this.
Absolutely. God, what a sobering story.
Yeah. On our watch, on our time on this planet. So I'm really keen to kind of empower lots of people about knowing about this socio-economic duty and how to mobilise it, both when it comes into law, but actually you don't have to wait until then. So many of us have run campaigns in our local communities to lobby and campaign to get our local authorities to voluntarily adopt it as good practice. Say, hey, you don't have to wait for the official law date, which is expected probably at some time next year. You can do it now, and it's desperate right now. So I'm really keen to empower people with that knowledge and to share that people can campaign to pass a motion in their local council to get this adopted as good practice right now.
Fantastic. So that's something that people can do as well. They can campaign. They can find out if their local authority has voluntarily commenced a duty. Well, that's people in England, people in Wales and Scotland. You've got it covered. But you can campaign for more meaningful commencement and greater degrees of accountability, and people in England can find out if their local authority has voluntarily commenced it, and again be looking at increasing participatory methods for decision making and accountability and budgeting and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's, I guess, another just sign of just how positive this duty is. Over 40 local authorities in England have already voluntarily adopted it as a good practice approach, which I think, is a real argument in its favour. So it's already making a difference. And if people are interested in learning now how to make that happen in your local area, check out the Equality Trust website.
Oh, nice little plug there, Vanessa. Thank you. And is there anything else that you'd like to tell us?
I think something I keep thinking about is all the different kinds of poverty. And I was presenting my research the other day in a room, and I said, how many different kinds of poverty can you think of? And I got everyone just to shout out examples. So people saying, child poverty, food poverty, clothing poverty, school uniform poverty, period poverty, hygiene poverty, in-work poverty, wage poverty. Gosh, so many, you know, housing poverty, pension poverty, funeral poverty, even giving our loved ones a send-off that we want to honour. And what I think about this is that so many charities providing, you know, crisis responses, trying to help people and put those sticking plasters on these issues. And I'm grateful to what they're doing to get people through the crisis. But we know that that's not addressing the underlying root causes. And what I like about the socio-economic duty is that it is proactive, it's preventative, and that is always better both in terms of preventing the human costs, but actually is also better for the public purse in the long run. We know that prevention was always more cost effective and useful than having to rectify problems that have escalated later on in terms of worsened health linked to poverty and poor housing conditions and nutrition, etc. So, you know, we know that children of this generation, because of poverty, have had less nutrition, and already, you know, health researchers are finding, you know, they have poorer health. The generation who are about a centimetre shorter than previous generations because of lack of nutrition, and their teeth are not as strong for those dental issues because they're not getting fresh vegetables to bite into to strengthen their teeth. So there's so many real world impacts we're seeing, but instead of just having reactive, sympathetic, charitable sticking plaster responses, we can just prevent this happening. We can design it out through good policy design together with the people who have been there and done it, have got the t-shirt, who live at the sharp end and know what could be done to make it work better for everyone.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's leaving us with a really positive note. We know we can do something. The time is right. The socio-economic duties on its way. Get campaigning. Get talking to your local authorities. You know, we don't have to live with these issues. We can design policy that designs them out of existence. Vanessa Boon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you and to learn so much about the socio-economic duty and to just actually feel really inspired about making a difference.
Thank you.